We spend a lot of time learning, understanding ideas, concepts, frameworks. But there's a gap that most people never cross. The gap between understanding something and actually living it. In the language of Torah, that gap is the difference between Binah and Daas. Binah is when something makes sense. Daas is when what you understand and how you actually live are aligned. When what you know becomes the way you experience and respond to reality. This series is about closing that gap, taking ideas that we understand intellectually and turning them into something real, something lived, something that shapes how we see everything that happens in our lives. We'll be working with Torah teachings that approach this with precision and structure, not just what to believe, but how reality actually works and how to operate within it correctly. So this is not a series about inspiration. It's a series about process, a structured path from Binah to Daas. I want to personally invite you to something I'm hosting this Shavuos night, the evening of Thursday, May 21st. I'm hosting an all-night learning here in Houston in a small, focused setting with Rabbanim you've heard on the podcast. Rabbi Shlomo Pill, Rabbi Yaakov Wolbe, Rabbi Mizell, Rabbi Ari Wolbe, and I'll be a part of the lineup as well. We'll be learning straight through the night and then davening a Nate's Minyan together at sunrise. This is not a big event. Space is very limited. It's meant to be intimate, serious, and real. If you're interested, email me at shemapodcastshow@gmail.com or join the WhatsApp community through the link in the show notes and message me there. If this speaks to you, reach out. I'd love to have you there. Now to the show. Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Shema Podcast, another installment in our series from Binah to Daas. You know, if you've been listening to the podcast over the last, many months, you probably noticed that we've been returning to one key idea, that of Kriyas Yam Suf, the splitting of the sea. We have discussed how this is a framework for going from Binah to Daas. We have discussed that this is not only a historical miracle, but is a reoccurring structure, a framework that people go through in life. We've discussed before the type of moment where there appears to be no path forward. The mind cannot see a solution. Someone can feel pressure and fear, and yet somehow still has to continue moving. And we've discussed the difference between Binah and Daas, the purpose of this series. Binah is understanding something intellectually, and Daas, again, is when the idea becomes integrated into the way the person actually experiences reality. And we also have discussed why Shira, song, comes specifically after the sea. I think that's important because, music is made up of separate sounds that eventually become experienced as one integrated structure. I think that's exactly what happened after Kriyas Yam Suf. Before the sea, events felt fragmented and frightening. Afterward, the Jewish people were suddenly able to look backward and recognize that what appeared disconnected was actually one process directed by Hashem the entire time. They were able to clearly see that. And this is why the song comes afterwards. The recognition only becomes fully clear after the event itself. In the rearview mirrors, when we can clearly see that everything was out of love and for the good. And I think all this becomes important once we realize that this is not only written in the Torah historically, but is also something we say every single morning in davening. And I'm not talking about just Shema here. I'm talking about before we get to the Shema. We say Shiras HaYam, the song of the sea. So I want to get into these verses and the significance of where it's placed in our siddur. But before we go through the verses themselves, I want to explain the approach I'm using here. So as I said, we say Shiras HaYam every morning as part of Pesukei D'Zimrah. And we are taught by Chazal that in every generation, a person is supposed to see himself as if he personally left Egypt. But obviously, none of us are literally standing in front of a sea with Egyptians chasing after us. At least I haven't met anyone. If that is actually your experience, I would love to hear from you. But I think that is something that is not part of someone's real experience in life. So if Chazal expects us to experience this personally and continuously, then these verses must also be describing reoccurring patterns in human experience. And that does not take away from the historical event. The historical event absolutely happened. But at the same time, the Torah also seems to be using the structure of the event to teach reoccurring ideas. So the question becomes, what do the different elements in the story represent? What does Egypt represent? What does Pharaoh represent? What does the sea represent? Why does the enemy speak with certainty right before collapse? Why does the Torah spend time discussing the nations, hearing and trembling afterward? And why is this section specifically placed at the end of Pesukei D'Zimrah before Yishtabach? I think once we analyze the verses carefully, a constant framework will begin to emerge. The goal here is to analyze and structure these verses that we say before we begin our davening so that we can truly experience and see ourselves as if we personally have left Egypt. To really see that these are all metaphors that we're meant to apply to all the challenges and struggles that we experience in our life, to use this properly, not as something that we read over in our davening and not contemplate the purpose of it, or to read it just as something that happened a long time ago, but to use this in the way it was intended when it was placed in our siddur. And I think we'll see that the song is repeatedly addressing this illusion that the systems and powers we encounter in life operate independently from Hashem. And we'll see that we're really getting at the heart of the idea, something we've discussed before, more Kabbalistic language, about removing the klipa from the sparks. The klipa being the illusion that the system of the world around us is operating through cause and effect and independently from our Creator. So let's get into this. The section begins, then Moshe will sing. What's interesting is that the Torah uses future tense, not saying, but will sing. And many commentators discuss why. But at the very least, it suggests that this Shira song is not only tied to one historical moment, but yet there is something ongoing about it, something reoccurring. It is also interesting that this verse begins with Moshe in the singular and then quickly shifts into the collective. I think that itself reflects how perception spreads through our nation once clarity begins to emerge, and how that if each of us begins to internalize the events in our individual lives and in the collective in this way, that it will spread through the collective consciousness of Klei Yisrael. So each of our efforts in this area can benefit the whole. And once we start thinking about the song this way, its placement in davening becomes very significant. Shiras HaYam appears at the end of Pesukei D'Zimrah, as we said, and right before Yishtabach. And then after that, of course, we say Baruch Hu and begin our davening. So this is obviously necessary preparation for our davening. And I think to understand why this matters, we first have to think about the purpose of Pesukei D'Zimrah itself. Before we can truly pray, our perception has to be recalibrated. We come into davening distracted, anxious, immersed with the pressures and obligations of life and the feeling that reality is being controlled by external forces. And we have to break free from that before we can begin to actually daven. And this allows us to gradually shift from fragmented perception toward awareness of Hashem's involvement in reality. And that is why Shiras HaYam is sort of at the culmination of all this in Pesukei D'Zimrah. I think the reason is because Kriyas Yam Suf represents the moment where those ideas become tested. It's easy to speak about Emunah abstractly. It's much harder when reality appears completely closed. I think that is exactly what the sea represents and how it plays out in our lives at all times. The sea represents moments where you cannot go backward, yet you cannot see how to move forward. There's no visible opening. And this is where Binah either starts becoming Daas or just collapses altogether. And again, there's tremendous tension there, where someone may have Emunah at the Binah level, but when they hit those seas in life, it breaks down. But as we'll see, what this is meant to do is to guide us on moving forward. As we've discussed before, the bridge between Binah and Daas is action. It's moving forward. And that's exactly what these verses are about. Because when we move forward, again, when you can't see how to move forward and there's no visible opening, but you move forward anyway, that's when it becomes Daas rather than just allowing the Binah to collapse in on itself. We also know from Gemara, Chazal teaches that in every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he personally left Egypt. Again, not simply remember Egypt, to experience it. And the Midrash says, Ma'aseh avos siman labanim. I think the most accurate translation is the actions of the forefathers are a sign for the children. I think we can tweak that translation just a bit and say the experiences of the forefathers become reoccurring patterns for their descendants. So the Torah is not only recounting events, it's also teaching structures and patterns, something have discussed multiple times. It's really the purpose of this series. It's understanding these structures and patterns. Again, a teaching from the Baal Salam is that in order to become spiritual, one must gain understanding of the system that Hashem created so we can begin to experience the system and experience Hashem. Even the word Mitzrayim comes from the word Metzar, constriction or limitation. So Egypt is not only a historical location, it also represents a condition of constriction. And leaving Egypt becomes an ongoing process of moving beyond internal limitation. And again, this idea of mental constriction is the idea of living with the klipa, the idea that everything happening in the world has its own independent power, is operating off some cause and effect. Our job as Jews is to remove that and expose the reality that is Hashem governing everything. That's what our mission is in the world. Before analyzing the song line by line, let's really get in more to identifying the central illusion the song is there to address and really dismantle. But first, we should know the sea is real. Egypt is real. Pharaoh is real. The army is real. The Torah is not denying the reality of the past or the reality of the challenges that we all experience from time to time within our own lives. The issue is not whether these things exist. The issue is whether they possess independent powers separate from Hashem. And really, the entire song keeps returning to that point. Egypt represents external dominance. Pharaoh represents the apparent controller of reality. The army and chariots represent organized systems of power. And the sea itself represents the experience of reality appearing completely closed. No visible opening, no visible path forward. So the splitting of the sea is not only about water splitting. The deeper shift is that the illusion of a closed reality collapses. And this explains why the song repeatedly focuses on what the enemy says, what the nations hear, what appears powerful, what melts, what collapses. The sea still existed. What transformed is how we perceived the sea in front of us. The song begins, horse and rider he threw into the sea. I believe the horse represents the system itself, the mechanism of apparent power. The rider represents the apparent controller of the system, a person, a structure, a decision maker. And naturally, people assign too much reality to these things. We think this institution controls the outcome. This person determines reality. This system decides my future. The song immediately starts challenging that perception. What appears to be control is not ultimate control. And when that structure collapses, the horse and rider collapse together. We experience that in the world today in our host nations, even in Israel today. But we see these structures that look like they have so much power and they can become corrupt, but we assign power to it. And that is why they exist, to give us the opportunity to see if that's nothing but a sea and to change our perception of it, that none of it has any power at all. Hashem just allows them to, just like any Pharaoh, project themselves as if they have power so that we can see through it. Very early in the song, we encounter, "This is my God, and I will build him a sanctuary." And Rashi says that an alternative interpretation based on the same root is, "I will make myself into a godly sanctuary." And he goes on to say, to remake oneself in God's image is to build the greatest of all sanctuaries. I think the sequence here matters. First comes, "This is my God," recognition. Then comes transformation. The sea itself does not complete the transformation. What changes first is the person's perception. Then the person wants to reorganize himself around that recognition. That seems to be the progression here. Or in other words, to change our perception of those seas that stand in front of us. These systems, people that project as if they have independent power from Hashem. By changing our perception, we are turning ourselves into a sanctuary for Hashem. Then the Torah expands the picture. Pharaoh's chariots and army. And now we move beyond isolated factors into entire systems. Armies, chariots, officers. What appears to be a highly organized structure of power. And psychologically, I think this matters because people become, overwhelmed through perceived complexity. Many variables, many moving parts, many dependencies. The song seems to respond by showing that what appears to be many independent powers is actually one structure. And therefore, when the structure collapses, it all collapses together. Then the Torah says, the depths covered them. I think this is describing a stage where externally nothing appears different yet. The pressure still appears real. The situation still appears unresolved because it's all happening beneath the surface. And the person can begin to include that nothing is happening. But the Torah specifically moves the action beneath the surface. The structure has already started collapsing before it becomes visible externally. Meaning when we get into davening, we may go into davening praying for something that we prayed for multiple times and think that nothing is happening. Something we talked about with Rabbi Yokaf Wolbe on a recent episode about the system of tefillah. But what the song is reminding us before we get into our davening is that things are happening beneath the surface first. Hashem is orchestrating things in the depths, hidden from our eyesight. Then the Torah lets us hear the enemy speaking. I will pursue, I will overtake. And it has such certainty to it. The enemy speaks as though the outcome is decided. I think this is exactly how distorted perception operates internally. The mind projects a future and then experiences that projection as certainty. And I think this is why the deeper enemy in the song is not only Egypt historically. The deeper enemy here that we all face is the illusion that anything besides Hashem independently controls reality. Egypt becomes the historical manifestation of that illusion. Then comes the turning point. You blew with your wind. The Torah does not describe a prolonged battle here. It simply says Hashem blew with his wind and suddenly the structure collapsed. I think this is important that throughout the song, the Torah keeps changing the imagery. Wind, breath, nostrils, right hand. The Torah is not describing obviously physical characteristics. It's describing what seems to be different modes of revelation and interaction. The Torah says, with the breath of your nostrils, the waters piled up. In Torah language, nostrils often relate to anger or judgment, but it's interesting that the Torah describes the collapse through breath rather than combat. No weapons, no physical struggle, I think the implication is that once reality becomes properly revealed, distortion becomes unstable. And externally, this may not look dramatic at first. I think on a broad macro level, we saw this with Iran, this huge enemy of really all Western civilization, most notably Israel. And within a few months, they've been totally dismantled. This is what I think Hashem continually does. He creates these pharaohs, that they have all this power, and he wants us to see through that. So again, externally, this may not look dramatic at first. Breath is invisible, which again fits the broader framework of the song. The structure may already be collapsing before the person fully sees it. Then the Torah says, your right hand, Hashem crushes the enemy. And at first glance, it seems strange because destruction would appear more connected to the left side, Gevurah and Din. But there's two ideas here. One is from our perspective, when our enemies get crushed, it is chesed. It is kindness. But there's another idea here as well, that with his right hand means because it's not really combat. It's just revelation. The right side represents alignment and clarity. Once reality becomes properly perceived, the illusion loses its stability. And the imagery is constantly changing throughout the song. At first, the enemy appears like stone, heavy and immovable. Then later, the enemy is referred to as straw, very fragile and insubstantial. Then the earth swallowed them. Point seems to be that what originally appears overwhelmingly solid eventually becomes almost insubstantial. And I think when we look back in our lives, we see these huge problems, and then all of a sudden they just sort of disappear. And this is what sort of Hashem wants us to see and to know this at all times. So then comes the line, who is like you among the mighty? Before the sea, reality appears divided among competing powers. You have Egypt, you have the system, fear, circumstance, the nature. After the sea, the perception breaks. The Jewish people do not simply conclude that Hashem is stronger than everything else. They realize that there was never any independent competing powers to begin with. That's why it's never Hashem overpowering these competing powers. It's just there was never competing powers to begin with, which is why the earth swallows them. They just disappear. Then the song discusses the nations hearing and trembling. At first, this sounds, very disconnected from the rest of the framework. What's the purpose of this? But I actually think it continues the same idea. Before the sea, external systems appear absolute and independently powerful. After the sea, those same systems lose their appearance of ultimate authority. The nations still exist, but they no longer appear ultimate. And psychologically, I think this matters a great deal. The systems in a person's life may still exist after the sea, meaning the situation that was concerning, that seemed to be a roadblock, to be a blockade for us, they can still exist once we walk through our seas. It's just that we no longer experience them the same way. Again, just because we are changing our perception of them. Then the song increasingly shifts into relationship language. Your people, you redeemed, you led. So the point is not merely proving a idea that there's only one power. It's getting to the key idea here. And the purpose of it all is relationship with Hashem, meaning the whole idea behind these terrifying seas that Hashem puts in front of us is so we will pray, so we will connect, so we will have relationship. And I think this also explains why the sea is not the end of the process. And after the sea comes guidance. The person is now being led differently because perception itself has changed. Meaning once you change your perception of the situation, it's like the relationship with Hashem takes on a new level. Then the Torah says they were still until the people passed through. And there's that word until, meaning the opening is temporary. I think the implication here, the idea, is that openings are given for a moment, not merely for comfort. And that, we have to take action. Another idea we've continually brought up, and this idea from Binah to Daas, is it requires action. So when those openings are there, it's time for movement. It's time for action. Then finally, you will bring them and plant them. The goal is not merely escaping pressure. The goal is becoming established and aligned. Meaning Hashem is bringing us to a place, not an external physical place, but to a place of consciousness where He can plant us, where we can be more grounded in reality and aligned with Him. Then the song concludes, Hashem will reign forever and ever. I think that line concludes the entire structure. Egypt appeared absolute. The systems appeared independently powerful. But every other power in the song turns out to be a temporary illusion. Only Hashem's kingship is permanent. I think that is ultimately why Chazal placed Shiras HaYam into daily davening, not merely to remember a historical event, but because it functions as a daily framework for dismantling the illusion of independent power. And then we conclude with saying, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. This very idea that those seas that were put in front of us that seemed like they were harsh judgment are actually concealed kindness for one express purpose, to bring us closer to Hashem, to develop the relationship. Or this is why this precedes our davening, because when we are done with this, hopefully God willing, it's my goal is that I'll be able to take this with me every morning to Shachris, these ideas, so that when we go into davening, we have the proper frame of mind to know that we are praying to the only power.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode and found it meaningful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast.